Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast. The podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman. And in this week's episode, I'd like to go over the difference between whole foods, processed foods, and ultra-processed foods. It's a question I get pretty often, and it can lead to some confusion because we can process some whole foods like freezing or cooking or fermenting. But that's a far cry from the processed and ultra-processed products that are engineered by the food industry. And the processed foods industry often has us believing that their products are healthy. So what does processed and unprocessed really mean? I hope that this short episode can clear up a little of that confusion. But first, I just wanted to tell you that if you're looking for some free resources, then I have plenty for you. First, download my 5 tips to get rid of cravings. And those 5 tips may not be what you think they are. So go to aftersugarclub.com and download your 5 tips today. Come check out the Life After Sugar Facebook page and subscribe to the Life After Sugar YouTube channel, as well as my Instagram account at My Life After Sugar, which is where you'll get all kinds of inspiration so that you can see that it's perfectly possible to live a happy and active life, even if you don't eat sugar. You can also check out my TikTok account at Netta_Life After Sugar. All right, so what's the difference between whole foods, processed foods, and ultra-processed foods? And does the number of ingredients on the label make any difference to the level of processing of a food? I don't know if you've heard of the NOVA classification before, but it's a system that categorizes foods by their level of processing. And according to NOVA, that originated in Brazil, there are 4 levels of processing for foods, and the first level is considered to be unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And these include whole fruits, whole vegetables, in other words, that haven't been juiced or otherwise liquidized or turned into other products. This category also includes unprocessed grains, fish, meat, seafood, and eggs. Examples of category 2, which are processed culinary ingredients, include oil, sugar, and salt. And I'll get back to this category in just a minute. Category 3 is considered to be processed foods, which include canned fish, smoked meats, fruit in syrup, or vegetables in brine. I'm going to have a few words to say about this category a little bit later. And the last category, number 4, is UPF, ultra-processed foods. And these include breakfast cereals, ready meals, cakes, cookies, candies, ice cream, and any foods that are artificially sweetened, whether it's with sweeteners or with sugar. And when I say food, I also include drinks, such as soft drinks or soda. Now, I think that this classification system that divides food according to its level of processing is a smashing idea. A much better idea than dividing foods into macronutrients, in other words, fats, carbs, and proteins, because that doesn't take into account what's been done to those carbs, fats, and proteins. And in any case, a lot of foods don't fit neatly into these 3 groups. and it can get pretty confusing pretty fast. On the other hand, I do have a few bones to pick with the NOVA classification system, so here goes. If you go with the NOVA food group number 1, which is unprocessed or minimally processed foods, then here's the list of some of the foods that category includes. And I quote, edible parts of plants, animals or fungi that haven't had any processing done to them. Or if they have, then it's minimal processing such as drying, freezing, cooking, pasteurization or grinding. And according to NOVA, these types of processing aim to make food more safe, edible and suitable for storage. So examples are fresh fruit, vegetables, whether raw or cooked, whole grains, legumes, meat, seafood, milk, eggs, as well as frozen fruits and frozen vegetables. But get this, Group 1 also includes pasta and flour, because grinding is considered to be minimal processing by the NOVA classification system. Now, I don't know about you, but as far as I know, flour, especially white flour, is highly processed and can affect the body totally differently from whole grains. In fact, as Dr. Robert Lustig explains, when grains are whole, the lattice work that the fibre in whole grains contains creates like a barrier that slows down the absorption of the starch in the grain. Whereas when the grain is ground up into powder, in other words, into flour, that fibre lattice work in the whole grain is pulverized and destroyed. So there's no slowing down of the absorption of the starch, which means that there's a faster and greater blood glucose spike and therefore insulin response. Most pasta, here in North America at least, is also highly processed. In fact, when refined white flour is made, the bran and the germ of the whole grain, in other words the fibre, is removed, pretty much leaving only starch. And this starch is in powder form. Yes, it's more shelf stable, but there's a huge nutrient loss, and even enriching or fortifying flour is just smoke and mirrors really by the processed foods industry. Because part of the problem is that the vitamins and minerals that food manufacturers use to enrich white flour are synthetic, and they're not in the natural form that would be bioavailable for the body. In other words, the body doesn't know what to do with them. It doesn't easily recognize and use those vitamins and minerals. So I'm not quite sure what those foods are doing in Group 1. In fact, where is the limit between minimally processed and processed? That is, in Group 2 of the NOVA system. So Group 2 is labelled processed culinary ingredients. So these are, and I quote, substances extracted from Group 1 foods or from nature or the landscape, and these processed culinary ingredients are used to cook and season Group 1 foods, and they're not intended for consumption on their own. Now, I'm not saying this, I'm just quoting what I found as an explanation of the NOVA food groups. Examples of these processed culinary ingredients are butter, other fats, oils, sugars, starches, honey, maple syrup, and salt. But hang on a minute, there's a huge difference between, say, butter and salt in the level of processing and, well, sugar, which is also part of that same group, Category 2 of the NOVA food classification system. Generally, salt is processed from salt mines, and basically it's just the evaporation of seawater or mineral-rich spring water in shallow pools. That's it. Whereas sugarcane or sugar beet, the natural unprocessed forms of sugar, undergo a whole series of steps and processes before they become what we know as sugar. And it's not just the number of steps in the processing, it's what it does to the original plant, the sugar beet or the sugar cane. After the different steps like milling, cleaning, crushing, boiling, purifying, spinning in a high-powered centrifuge, then there's the affination process, where sugar is put through carbonatation. And during this stage, the sugar is combined with carbon dioxide gas and calcium hydroxide, also known as slacked lime, to form rock-hard sugar crystals. And carbonatation also removes more of the impurities and some colour. Then comes decolorization, where the sugar crystals are washed of their natural colour, and this is done by filtering the sugar through bone char, activated carbon, or ion exchange resin. And finally, this liquid is boiled, washed with water, and spun again several times to create the granulated sugar crystals we know as table sugar. So all this processing and all these processes affect the original plant, the sugarcane or the sugar beet, which is completely stripped of any possible nutritional value it may have had. That's right, sugar has zero nutritional value, and it's been through so many different processes to refine it into the white crystals that we know as table sugar that I just don't understand how it can be put in the same group as salt or even butter, which is basically just cream that's been churned. So even if you look at the list of ingredients on a bag of white sugar and you only see one ingredient, sugar, that doesn't mean that it's a whole food. In fact, in my humble opinion, the number of ingredients is not a very accurate way of judging whether or not a food is unprocessed, processed, or ultra-processed. In this case, sugar is ultra-processed. And you could argue that if you gather together several unprocessed ingredients, like for a salad, for example, then you could say you have half a dozen ingredients in your salad, but that doesn't make the salad processed or ultra-processed. So again, the number of ingredients in a food, in a dish, or in a product is not always a super reliable indicator of the level of processing of said food, dish, or product. I want to take a quick break to say that if this is your first time here, then welcome and thank you for listening to this podcast. And whether you're new or a regular and you haven't yet rated or reviewed this podcast, could I ask you to scroll down and tap on the stars to rate this podcast and also to write a short review to let me know how this podcast is helping you in your life after sugar. I love reading your reviews. For example, this 5-star review from Laurie, who says, "This is an empowering podcast." Laurie says, "I love all the craving support and education from this excellent podcast. I always learn something new and empowering." And when you rate and review this podcast, not only does it encourage me to continue making new episodes, but it also helps to share this podcast and have more people see it so that we can help more people feel better and lose weight with less sugar. So again, thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast and for spreading the word about sugar. So before the break, we looked at the first 2 categories of the NOVA scale, which are Group 1, unprocessed or minimally processed foods, and Group 2, processed culinary ingredients. And although I think that grouping foods according to their level of processing is a great idea, in practice, it can still be confusing to us consumers. Because where is the line between unprocessed, processed, and ultra-processed? Well, let's have a look at group 3, which is called processed foods in the NOVA scale. So in group 3 of the NOVA scale, processed foods are considered to be products such as bottled vegetables, canned fish, fruits in syrup, cheeses, and freshly made breads. All food products that are essentially made by adding salt, oil, sugar, or other substances from group 2 and group 1 foods. And I'm quoting here that the processes in group 3 include various preservation or cooking methods, and in the case of breads and cheese, non-alcoholic fermentation. What I can see in group 3 is that most processed foods have 2 or 3 ingredients and are recognizable as modified versions of group 1 foods. Group 1 being unprocessed or whole foods. And group 3 foods are edible by themselves or more usually in combination with other foods. And again, I quote that the purpose of processing here in group 3 is to increase the durability of group 1 foods or to modify or enhance their sensory qualities. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but I'm wondering what that even means. So I did a little digging, and here's what I found. Sensory qualities of foods are one of the most important properties for food, and these include color, texture, flavor, smell, and appearance of food. And these are important because they ensure the quality of a product and whether consumers find this food tempting and fresh. And believe me, the food industry knows all about the sensory properties of food, and they know exactly how to enhance texture, flavor, aroma, and the visual aspects of foods, or should I say, food products. But group 3 foods mostly have 2 or 3 ingredients. For example, vegetables preserved in salt or brine, or vinegar, or by pickling, tomato extract, pastes or concentrates with salt and or sugar, beef jerky, bacon, canned fish such as sardines and tuna with or without added preservatives, salted, dried, smoked or cured meat or fish, coconut fat, salted or sugared nuts and seeds, fermented alcoholic beverages such as beer, alcoholic cider and wine, and freshly made cheeses, and freshly made or unpackaged breads made of wheat flour, yeast, water, and salt. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm still slightly confused at the difference between group 2 foods, called processed culinary ingredients like oils, fats, salt, and sugar, and group 3 foods called processed foods that are described as derived directly from foods that are recognized as versions of the original foods. Because, quite frankly, I see a huge difference between foods in the same group. For example, vegetables preserved in salt or brine, in other words, lacto-fermented vegetables, that are also probiotic and naturally preserved by the fermentation process, and say, fruits in sugar syrup. And also a huge difference between salted nuts and sugared nuts, not just for their nutritional value, but for how some of us behave around those foods. Moving on to group 4, ultra-processed foods. And again, I quote, that these are industrial formulations made entirely or mostly from substances extracted from foods, like oils, fats, sugar, starch, and proteins, or derived from food constituents like hydrogenated fats and modified starch, or foods that are synthesized in labs from food substrates or other organic sources like flavor enhancers, colors, and several food additives that are used to make these products hyper-palatable. And Group 4 ultra-processed foods also come from manufacturing techniques that include extrusion, molding, and pre-processing by frying. And this group includes ultra-processed beverages as well as foods. In fact, Group 1 foods are a very small proportion of, or are even absent from, Group 4 foods of these ultra-processed products. Unsurprisingly, the list for Group 4 foods is the longest, and it includes sweet or savory or salty packaged snacks, biscuits or cookies, ice cream, frozen desserts, chocolates, candies, confectionery in general, cola, soda, and other carbonated soft drinks, energy and sports drinks, and also canned, packaged, dehydrated or powdered, instant soups, noodles, sauces, desserts, drink mixes and seasonings, as well as sweetened and flavored yogurts, including fruit yogurts, dairy drinks, including chocolate milk, sweetened juices, margarines and spreads, pre-prepared or packaged meat, fish and vegetables, pre-prepared pizza and pasta dishes, pre-prepared burgers, hot dogs and sausages, and poultry nuggets and fish sticks, as well as other animal products made from remnants. Ooh. And Group 4 also includes packaged breads, like hamburger bread and hot dog buns, and any baked products made with ingredients such as hydrogenated vegetable fat, sugar, yeast, whey, emulsifiers, and other additives. And the list also includes breakfast cereals and bars, as well as infant formulas and drinks, and meal replacement shakes, in the same list as pastries, cakes, and cake mixes, and distilled alcoholic beverages such as whiskey, gin, rum, and vodka. Pretty long list, huh? And the vast majority of products in regular supermarkets or grocery stores are these ultra-processed products. In fact, to such an extent that a lot of us feel that if we don't consume these products, then there's nothing left to eat. And where I trip up a little bit about what's in this group, Group 4, ultra-processed foods, is that sugar is listed here, but it's also listed in Group 2, in processed culinary ingredients. And because the NOVA food classification system helps us group foods according to the extent and purpose of the processing they undergo, if we follow that logic, then Group 2 is less processed than Group 4. So how can sugar be in both? Because let's face it, white sugar itself, in fact any type of refined sugar, even brown sugar or organic sugar, is a highly processed product, and whether or not it's part of other highly processed foods or ultra-processed foods, that doesn't change the fact that this ingredient itself is processed, and not only ultra-processed, but also devoid of any nutritional value. So the bottom line, for me at least, is that sugar as an ingredient belongs in Group 4, not Group 2. And not only because it's highly processed, but because it can cause cravings, weight gain, risk of heart disease, acne, type 2 diabetes, risk of cancer, risk of depression, skin aging, cellular aging, digestive issues. Well, the list goes on and on. And so you have to wonder, is sugar even a food? So in this episode, I wanted to make the distinction between whole foods or unprocessed foods processed foods and ultra-processed foods. And I'm not the first one to ask myself these questions. The NOVA classification system has already done a great job, except it just seems like some parts of it are a bit confusing, even contradictory. So in my humble opinion, if we insist on splitting foods into groups, then I would simplify the whole thing and just have two groups: whole foods and everything else. And whole foods, in my definition, are those that haven't been tampered with by the processed foods industry, and also are foods that you find delicious, that nourish you, that fill you up, that give you energy, and that make your grocery shopping easier, rather than giving you cravings or making you sick or overweight. And these include vegetables, fruit, legumes, nuts, meats, fish, seafood, herbs and spices, eggs, cheese, milk, cream, butter, all with no additives, and fermented dairy, like plain yogurt, milk kefir, and sour cream, as well as other fermented foods and drinks, like kombucha, sauerkraut, and kimchi. And speaking of drinks, coffee, tea, and water. Does that sound like a restrictive list? Well, I love how author Rob Wolf puts it. He created what he calls a food matrix, where he has a list of proteins, veggies and fruit, fats, and herbs and spices. And he says that if we take just one item from each of these groups of whole foods, we get a total of thousands of different combinations, enough to last us for several lifetimes. So I do believe that with whole foods, the restriction doesn't necessarily come from the foods themselves, but rather from our lack of inspiration about how to put these foods together to make different and interesting combinations. And that's exactly what you learn right at the beginning of the Freedom from Cravings Formula program. It's a program that's specifically designed for women over 50 who want to get rid of cravings and feel more in control around food, especially sugar and comfort foods. In the program, you'll get step-by-step guidance and customized support through the 5-step formula that I've developed to help you get control over cravings so that you can finally live your life with more energy and fit into your favorite clothes effortlessly and feel confident in your food choices so that you can ditch the shame and embarrassment that you feel every time your emotions make you slip or fall off the wagon, and so that you never feel like you're on some kind of a restrictive diet. If you're at the stage of your life where you're finally ready to look after yourself, let's chat. You can hop on a free clarity call with me at any time by going to aftersugarclub.com and clicking on the big green button, Schedule a Clarity Call. We'll have a quick 30-minute one-on-one chat to see if the Freedom from Cravings Formula 90-day program is a good fit for you. So go to aftersugarclub.com. Speak soon. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.